Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here in Geneva. Welcome to this press conference with Yvonne Mokgoro. Ms. Mokgoro is the chairperson of one of the newest mandated mechanisms mandated by the Human Rights Council. This is the expert mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in law enforcement. The genesis of this body was the events surrounding the murder of George Floyd in May 2020 and other such cases. Following an urgent debate at its 47th session in June 2020, the Human Rights Council requested the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to write a report and make recommendations, one of which was the creation of this expert mechanism. In December 2021, the President of the Human Rights Council appointed Justice Yvonne Mokgoro of South Africa, Dr. Tracie Keesee of the United States, and Professor Juan Méndez of Argentina to the expert mechanism. The mechanism presented its first written report to the Human Rights Council yesterday, and this can be found online at the mechanism's webpage. If you need help finding that, you can ask me later. Ms. Mokgoro is with me in the room, while Ms. Keesee and Mr. Méndez are joining us online. So without further ado, I invite Ms. Mokgoro to make a short opening statement, and then I'll open the floor to questions, and I'll start in the room and then go online. And if you could state your your name and your media organization ahead of asking the question, I'd be grateful. Over to Ms. Mokgoro for her opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. And I extend on behalf of the mechanism a warm welcome to everybody in the room, the journalists and everybody else included, who are attending this press conference today. And also everyone who's watching us remotely. My colleagues, Dr. Tracie Keesee and Professor Juan Méndez, are connected with us from the United States. Thank you so much, Tracie and Juan. I'm grateful for your presence, as I know it is very early morning for both of you in the United States. I've come to Geneva this week to present the mechanism's first report to the Human Rights Council in one of its kind interactive dialogue, side by side with the Acting High Commissioner for Human Rights and with the presence of two directly affected individuals, one from the United States and the other from Brazil. Since our appointment in December 2021, that is last year, with the assistance of the full secretariat from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we've actively engaged with states, as well as a wide range of stakeholders, including United Nations human rights mechanisms and agencies, national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and directly affected individuals and all their communities. We held extensive consultations since our appointment, including expert consultations which informed our report, putting to light the sorely needed collection, analysis, and use of disaggregated data, its collection, analysis, and its use to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. We acknowledge in our report that data collection will not in itself resolve long-standing racism and race discrimination. However, we do stress the paramount importance of making systemic racism visible by disaggregated data as a precondition for any remedial action. Many before us have stressed the importance of disaggregated data However, in the field of law enforcement and criminal justice, more than anywhere else, transparency has been shown to have deterrent effect and to have reduced fatalities and is conducive to increased accountability. We see continuing reports of fatal outcomes of encounters with law enforcement officers and the criminal justice system for Africans and people of African descent, including through racial profiling and excessive use of force. Yet, such violent encounters remain largely underreported, often for fear of reprisals, negative past experiences with law enforcement, or the perception or belief that the complaint will be superfluous anyway. In short, if we want it to count, we always say, we must count it. And if the systems and structures don't show, the numbers will. In the 3 years of our mandate, we plan to engage systematically with states to advance effective and accountable policing and criminal justice practices, and to help close trust deficits by promoting accountability and redress for victims and/or their families. As we indicated to the Council yesterday in our report, we will be traveling to Sweden in a few weeks, and we hope other countries will also extend invitations for country visits to the mechanism. And with those few words, can I thank you for listening? And my colleagues, Tracie Keesee and Juan Méndez, and I will welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Justice Mokgoro. We are ready to take questions now from the room. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question in the room? No, nobody? Are you sure? Okay. Ah, yes, one over here. So just wait a second, we'll bring the microphone to you. And then please ask your question, but not forgetting to state your media and your name. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Patricia Aquino from Puma Podcast in the Philippines. I was wondering what you thought of the response of the American delegate yesterday, and what are the plans for the country visit to the US?
We have indicated an interest in visiting the United States. And we have up to now not have an invitation. However, there are prospects that we will get an invitation soon, hopefully in the early months of next year. Yeah. You see, the thing with invitations is that countries voluntarily invite the mechanism. And once the mechanism has accepted an invitation, which we are highly likely to accept to the United States, and arrangements have been made for the visit, the mechanism will and plans to make abundant use, maximum use of the opportunity to engage state authorities and law enforcement and criminal justice authorities at the highest level in order to make our visit most effective. We plan with each and every visit to engage with these authorities on a variety of issues. If there are incidents that we have to engage the authorities about, we will do so, like the United States, for example. And we will make, as I say, optimum use of the opportunity to inform the recommendations that we will be making with regard to those country visits in the reports, the relevant reports that will address the issues of country visits. We are planning, however, to engage on a number of issues, as I say, so that we continue to get the responses that we require so that we make recommendations in our report, which will be concrete and which should be realized. So we do not have dates and particular plans as to when we will be visiting the United States, but it is on the cards.
Thank you very much for that that answer. Yes, I believe we have a follow-up from the same journalist. Thank you.
Any reaction to the statement of the American delegate?
Remind me what the statement of the American delegate was.
Did you have a reaction to the statement made by the US representative yesterday?
No. We have not responded to any of the issues raised. We have a record of the issues raised, and we will take those issues into account. And if it is necessary to respond directly, we will do so. Otherwise, we will take the issues raised into account when we deal with country visits and decide what issues or what engagements we have to conduct with the authorities, whether law enforcement, whether state authorities, criminal justice system authorities. Those issues will be taken into account, and we will engage with a view to have concrete recommendations surrounding the issues raised.
Thank you. Yes, we have another question from the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mokgoro. I'm Kojo Prim, a student of democratic policing from UCT, South Africa.
Oh, that's right, Professor.
And
yes.
I get very interested when it comes to issue of law enforcement. The question is, whom do we hold accountable? Is it the police, the law enforcement agency, or the state? Increasingly, we are having police legitimized as a problem globally. Even the so-called advanced countries, yesterday we were told that from January to September, 573 people have been killed in America by the state police. And I know in South Africa, we're having state policing regime towards the south and almost everywhere. Whom are we holding accountable if we are supposed to run to the police for refuge, for protection, for cover, and the same state institution, law enforcement, tend to abuse and they're killing us? Where are we? We can't run to the military because that's not their regime. The police are the ones who are supposed to protect us as civilians, and they ended up killing us. Are we holding them accountable, or the state that we have to hold accountable? Thank you.
That's a very apt question. I don't want to say good question because it would look like I'm patronizing you. Very apt question. Our mandate requires that we hold those who are liable for police action racism, race discrimination and inequality in the context of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. We hold them accountable and also obtain redress for the victims and their families or communities. But I will give Professor Méndez this question to respond to, because it falls squarely in our mandate. And I think Professor Méndez will be able to respond to it adequately. Prof. Méndez?
Yes, thank you, Yvonne. We are a mechanism under international human rights law. And so for us, we hold the state responsible to the international community for complying with all the obligations arising from international human rights law, including the principle of non-discrimination in all its manifestations. So what we look for is if a state doesn't have the mechanisms to hold accountable its agents for actions that violate the principle of non-discrimination or that are racially motivated against specific members of the society, that would make the state responsible to the international community, and we would call that responsibility. The accountability of each individual actor is, of course, to its institution in domestic law, and within the institution to the civil and democratic authorities. But that is a matter of domestic law that we expect to look at. As Justice Mokgoro said, we will look at racism in law enforcement in the broader context of criminal justice and the functioning of all institutions, including the judiciary and the legislative and executive branches of government as well. But for us, the responsible entity, the accountable entity, is the state itself.
Thank you, Prof. I will give our colleague Tracie Keesee an opportunity if she needs to say something and add to what Prof. Méndez has said.
Thank you, Madam
Dr.
Chair,
Keesee?
and thank you. And I would just add that as we talk about one of those entities that is the actor of being the police. So as we extend that through, we also want to make sure that there are those mechanisms in place that it extends and reaches through the police. So when you're holding that mechanism accountable through the state, that there are those pieces in place where immediately the actions are felt, where officers themselves are being held accountable. And that means that you are having judicial actions against those actors themselves in extension through the state. So I want to just add that piece, because that is who we will be interacting with through our work as well. So I want to make sure that we do extend through and make sure that we are talking about law enforcement in being that actor. So thank you, Madam Chair, for that opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Keesee.
So are there more questions from the room? Thank you. Yes, we have one over here. And I'll come to you next. Yes, thank you.
Bonjour à tous, je suis Evelyne, journaliste à l'Agence congolaise de presse. Je comprends, mais malheureusement, il est difficile pour moi de poser ma question en anglais.
Yeah, just for translation.
Alors, j'aimerais savoir, madame, je ne sais pas si j'ai bien compris, vous êtes expert des mécanismes indépendants, je présume. Quand vous dites indépendant, vous êtes de la société civile. Alors, en amont, hier, j'ai suivi les rapports du groupe de travail sur les abus qui sont commis sur les personnes d'origine africaine, de manière concrète sur les enfants et tout. Alors, de votre côté, qu'est-ce que vous faites pour prévenir cela? Je me dis, oui, les États, les individus, on parle maintenant de la police aux États-Unis et tout, qui commettent des abus. Mais moi, je me dis, la société civile devait être du côté de la prévention Qu'est-ce que la société civile fait? Qu'est-ce que votre mécanisme fait pour que cela n'arrive pas? Et du côté des États maintenant, qu'est-ce que vous faites pour que les États mettent en place des mécanismes pour comprendre que, qu'on soit d'origine africaine ou non, on est et on reste humain avec les mêmes droits?
Is that it? Thank you so much for that question. Every incident or occurrence of racism, race discrimination, and inequality in the context of law enforcement and criminal justice system is part of our mandate. Any incident, civil society, individuals, groups of people, wherever racism in the context of law enforcement manifests itself, the mechanism has the mandate to deal with it. And what in such cases we will need is a report and details of the incident so that we know and can decide how to deal with it, how to engage with the particular law enforcement authorities who might have engaged and have been involved in the incident. We see it as an incident. Not only is the mechanism mandated to address systemic racism, race discrimination, and inequality against Africans and people of African descent, it is also mandated to deal with specific incidents where we will engage with the relevant state authorities, but particularly with the relevant law enforcement officials, as Dr. Keesee has indicated. So that falls squarely into our mandate. We will deal with it once we get the details and credible information so that we can engage with the necessary authorities about these issues and make recommendations for a number of reasons: accountability, redress. Somebody has to take accountability for the commission of the act.
Thank you very much. And so we had another question here from the room.
I'm Suleiman.
Thanks.
Hi, sir. This is Suleiman Najabi from Afghanistan, Afghan freelancer. My question is that when the Taliban came to the power, they revoked the constitution of Afghanistan, the other laws that were created in the last 20 years, or the same numbers of laws that existed in the past. The legal structures that differentiated the way of governance, such as the Commission of Administrative Reforms, Civil Services, the High Commission for Human Rights, the Parliament, and the election commissions. Everything has been revocated by the decree of Mullah Hibatullah, the leader of the Taliban. Now they are torturing, they are in prison the people, they are torturing the civil society activists and the journalists, but there is no one who bring them to the desk of the law or to justice. One single Talib is Bayoun. He is police, he is law, he is lawmaker, he is judiciary system, he is a judge. whatever he wants, he can do. So who is gonna ask from them? There's no any government, not any political legitimacy. So who's accountable? Who's responsible? Thank you.
Is your question directed at the expert mechanism, chair of the expert mechanism, or more generally?
Actually, my question is for the mechanism. With which mechanism the Human Rights Council gonna follow the activities of the Taliban that doing about the law?
Okay, I understand. Thank you for your question. I think this falls outside of the scope of this press conference. So unless you have anything to say, Justice Mokgoro, on this topic, we don't need to answer that question.
I see it as a concern which is directed at the mechanism, but it is of a general nature. And as you say, you would like to have information as to how to deal with it, because even if it doesn't fall squarely into our mandate, because our mandate focuses on racism against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement and the criminal justice system. But I think you do need information, perhaps on how to deal with it, because there are other mechanisms at the United Nations which deal with questions like those. And I will ask Professor Méndez to respond to you and provide you with some information very briefly, because as Matthew said, it doesn't fall within the mandate of the purview of this press conference. But just as a concerned individual, I think we'll ask Professor Méndez to respond to you briefly, because he is very familiar with the human rights protection landscape at the United Nations.
Well,
Professor
we will.
Méndez,
Yes,
just
thank you.
briefly, kindly.
Yes, thank you. We will strive to act on cases that fall under our mandate wherever they happen, and deal and communicate with the authorities represented in the United Nations. Of course, we will direct our queries to the relevant authorities under our mandate. And when we issue judgments about whether a violation has occurred, we will take into account whether there were relevant safeguards and mechanisms in the domestic jurisdiction to deal with those matters. If there aren't in place, then we will take that into account in terms of calling on the relevant state to correct the failings of protection of individuals and of collectivities in their domestic jurisdiction.
Thank you very much for that answer, Professor Méndez. We have another question in the room. I'm just waiting for the microphone. Thank you, sir. Please.
Thank you. I'm Keesee. I came from Ethiopia. I work for the Reporter newspaper based in Addis capital. My question is, myself heard of, there is the incidence of systematic and structural injustice, excessive use of force, discrimination against colored people is mostly, we heard, I heard most of the incidents are like a deliberate act against Black people. So if I'm right, if some of the incidents are a deliberate act, do you think there is any other mechanism other than political willingness to eradicate this problem? Thank you.
It is exactly part of our mandate to address those issues. We don't need the political will, we must do it. We must address those issues. Incidents, as I said earlier, not only should we be addressing questions of systems which are racist and racially discriminate against Africans and people of African descent, we must also address questions of individual incidents where there has been racism, race discrimination, and inequality in the context of law enforcement against Africans and people of African descent. So whereas other mechanisms would address questions of racism, race discrimination, inequality generally, this mechanism focuses on racism, race discrimination, and inequality in the context of law enforcement. Racism, race discrimination, inequality against Africans and people of African descent in the context of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. As I said to the gentleman there are a number of other mechanisms at the United Nations and bodies which deal with aspects of racism, sometimes even deal generally with racism against Black people and or Africans and people of African descent. But now this one would shift focus a bit and deal with, in the context of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, racism, race discrimination, and inequality against Africans and people of African descent, so that if systems show that there is such racism against Africans and people of African descent, and or there are specific incidents which have occurred in one or another location, country, that is part of the mandate of this mechanism, and this mechanism must deal with it, engage with authorities, come up with recommendations, and report to the Human Rights Council. A report with recommendations which will eventually serve before the General Assembly, where state representatives are part of.
Thank you very much for that answer, that question and that answer. I notice we do have several journalists online. If anybody wants to ask a question, now would be a good time to raise your hand. I'll just give you a second or two. Is there any other question that we can take from the room? Just looking around. Ah, yes, we have one over there. Just wait for you to get the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, Madam. I am Geraldine Pascual from the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility in the Philippines. In your report, you were stressing about the importance of data collection in this endeavor, right? And I think you mentioned here that the expert mechanism was also informed that the lack of capacity or will to collect and use data feeds into a lack of trust in the data. I think this is what you mentioned in your report. Can you elaborate a bit on that? And you also mentioned that COVID is a factor in data collection. How has your work been so far in this regard? Any problems you encountered? A bit of information about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And I will ask Dr. Keesee to respond to it on behalf of the mechanism. Dr. Keesee?
Thank you and good morning. And I am actually, thank you, Chair. And so the importance not only of the data collection, and I'll speak to the COVID portion of that first. And COVID is only one of the factors in sort of hampering in data collection. And that is because the focus, of course, was on getting this pandemic under control and the inability for folks to be able to engage in a specific way. But in the report, when we talk about what are those factors that don't allow for data collection, there are many, especially on a global level. And those things, of course, we hear from those who have been trying to get this work done. And those often are because it is seen as a threat to privacy, that there are other issues that stand in the way, whether they are legal or legislative. And much as the report is outlined, is those are things that are often used for us as barriers to get to the data. And as the chairperson has so aptly said to all of us is that those that cannot be counted don't allow us to really have a full focus on the issue itself. And again, we have had numerous examples of how those things and those blockers can be moved in order for the data collection to move forward. And in those examples, we see that you can collect the data without any extra burden when you look at those sort of ways to do this. This work can be done in partnership with NGOs on the ground, with universities. Oftentimes that burden is given as officers themselves cannot do this work. We know that that is not true. We know that there are many ways in which this can be done, but if you cannot count it, we do not know to which extent this type of discrimination, racial profiling is occurring. So we know that work can be done. We also know that we have to protect the data that we are collecting. We know how to do this. Again, this is not new. It is, again, going back to the will to want to have to do this. And so to COVID, for many of us, we know that this is still a burden on many countries, but we know that there are ways to get these things done. And so as we focus on that, law enforcement should be required to collect the data. And we know that there are ways in which this can be, happen. We know that there are tools that can, minimally invasive tools in which this can happen, and especially low cost ways, because oftentimes budgets are also given as reasons why these things cannot happen. So we want to make sure that when we do the data and we get data, especially when we're talking about use of force, when we're talking about stopping folks on the street on their way to work, in their cars, that all of this information is critically important, not only to measure the magnitude, but to make sure that when this is done, it's also the beginnings of a deterrent for this type of interaction. So for your question, is COVID sort of, keeping us from getting this work done? I would tell you in the early years of COVID, of course, all things stopped. But now, as we begin to open up and we begin to hopefully try to get a hold on COVID, there are really no excuses why these things cannot happen and move forward. Again, it's not just about political will. The excuses of the past, current, and hopefully not in the future should not be allowed to stand. So there is lots of work to be done. And that is the work of the mechanism, and that is the work that we will be doing as we move forward. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Keesee. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for your question. And we have a question at the end of the table here in the room. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. This is Hamid Daghafri, Fox News reporter in Afghanistan and chief editor at Tasan News. We all witnessed this tragedy incident which ended with George Floyd's life. George Floyd was one of the victims, but there are more George Floyd in the world which tolerance racism and discrimination, like Hazara minority in Afghanistan and Tajik minority in Afghanistan. They are suffering such a tolerance. And my question is that is there a mechanism exist to avoid such an incident in the near future?
A similar question was asked by the gentleman here, Suleiman. Yes, also from Afghanistan. Yeah, it was a similar question, a similar concern. And trust me, it is a concern. However, this mechanism will focus on its mandate. If an incident or an issue falls within the mandate of the mechanism must address it, must determine, and must make recommendations to resolve try to achieve concrete results, and must report on the issues. Now, our mechanism focuses on racism, race discrimination, inequality against Africans and people of African descent in the context of law enforcement. I know earlier you asked whether we should not be concerned about those issues which befall anybody because whether you're African or a person from African descent or not, it is an atrocity to be racist against anybody. However, and we recognize that, and that is why there are other mechanisms which deal with those kind of broader issues. This mechanism has to focus because of the numerous incidents which have lately come to light and drove the United Nations to realize the need for a mechanism such as this. So we are focused, but there are mechanisms or bodies, UN bodies, which deal with those issues. And as we said to Suleiman earlier, Professor Méndez had responded to the question before you came in. There is assistance that you can get from other mechanisms at the United Nations. You only have to be connected with those mechanisms, and there will be a way in which you can be connected with those mechanisms so that you raise these issues with them.
Thank you for that answer. I see we have Nina Larson from Agence France Presse asking a question online. Thank you. Take it away, Nina.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question, and thank you for doing this press conference. I just had a question on the data collection aspect. You mentioned that this is a big problem in quite a few countries. I'm wondering if you have any examples of countries who are doing this right. And also, I know that the United States, there's an issue that there is no centralized data collection on this. Have you had any conversations with authorities there that show some sort of willingness to move in that direction? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Prof. Méndez, can I give you that question to respond to?
Well, in our very early consultations, we understand that there are some countries that do collect data, and in fact that collect it disaggregated. But even in those countries, we also understand that the data is not followed by good analyses that can then prompt reform and institutional ways of dealing with racism in law enforcement. So I don't we will look for good practices that we can share with other countries, but always with a view to having very complete data collection, disaggregated data collection, and data collection that is properly analyzed and leading to institutional action as well. I'll let, I think Dr. Keesee would be in a better position to answer the whole question than me, but also the question about the United States.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Keesee, will you add to that response, kindly?
I will, thank you. And Nina, here in the United States, I mean, there's numerous examples of ways to collect data, disaggregate, and to make it public and to be transparent about it. And I think that one of the things that we are still grappling with in the United States is some of it somewhat similar is happening worldwide, and that is police data is notoriously not good. And that is not just in the collection of that, it is making sure that it's transparent, making sure that the analysis, as Professor Méndez pointed out, is done in a way in which it does, highlight what is going on. So I think that as we are moving through not just what we do here in the United States, there are things that we can learn as we move through as a mechanism. But I think as we are, we have asked for our visit with United States, there are, definitely things here that we could be lifting up and sharing. And there are also things I believe that are happening across the world that we can learn from. But one of the things that we really need to focus on is how do we make sure that there is a unified way and a will to make sure that that data is collected, and not just collected for, as our our esteemed chairperson will tell you, so we can make sure that we have a full understanding of what the issue is, but making sure that it's collected and shared publicly. Because that's the other piece of this, is we often will collect data and it is not shared publicly. So I will stop there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Keesee. And if we come across those countries, as we do our country visits, it will probably be one of the questions or the issues that we'll have to discuss engage with the particular countries. There are scientific guidelines on how to collect, analyze, and use data disaggregated in terms of race, ethnicity, or ethnic origin. We will share those with the countries and provide them with the guidelines and urge them to follow those guidelines and deal with data collection in accordance with the guidelines. Because part of our mandate is to make recommendations to member states or countries where we will have visits, and to ensure that there is reform of the systems which would assist in dealing with questions of racism and race discrimination. So we will share these guidelines with the countries to capacitate them and increase their capability to collect and analyze data appropriately.
Thank you. Yes, Nina has a quick follow-up, I believe. Nina.
Yes, thank you. It's just a follow-up. When you're preparing to discuss with countries, I guess that one of the fears is to have actual good people on this will bring the spotlight to the problems inside the countries, and all countries are kind of wary of being in that spotlight when it comes to showing systemic racism in the countries. How are you planning on discussing with them to sort of explain the benefits of actually bringing out this data when it will shine a spotlight on the problem in the country? Thank you.
Well, indeed, as you say, we will need to highlight and discuss with them the benefits that they might derive from appropriate collection, analysis, and use of data disaggregated in terms of race and ethnicity. And hopefully when we show them the benefits, they will understand the need. In fact, we would require them to analyze the data in terms, as I said earlier, the guidelines that we will provide for them. Of course, it is not easy for any country or state to just openly admit to being racist. I've never come across any authority who readily does that. But as we said earlier in my introduction, if the system of laws, policies, and regulations do not show that there is racism, but we have incidents of racism in the same countries, it means that something is wrong somewhere. If we are all equally protected before the law, but there are incidents that show that there is discrimination against Africans and people of African descent, we need to align. We need to align the systems with international human rights protections. So it would be required that countries engage in the appropriate analysis, collection and analysis and use of data. And our mechanism is enjoined to seek cooperation with the countries or states that we will visit. And it will be in the spirit of cooperation that we will lend a hand and assist with a view to addressing the issues which plague the society or the people who are served by law enforcement in the particular countries. Our opportunity is going to be when we meet with the authorities during our country visits. And as I said earlier, we will have to optimize our opportunity to make a difference in every country or in every state visit that we engage in. We plan to do that.
Thank you, Justice Mokgoro. And thank you to our experts who were able to join us online. I think we're coming to the end of this press conference now. The Human Rights Council continues this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and we hope you can follow along there. And once more, thank you to our experts who have given us a very interesting set of answers to think upon. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.